I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom. In this video, I'm going to do my first kind of comparison of the film that a book is based on. In this case, it is The Wizard of Oz. Now, if you've checked out my Wizard of Oz review, I did reviews the kind of most of the at least first 4 to 5 books of the entire series, which is huge. Balmwork wrote several of them. Other people took hold, and I think there's like 20 total Oz books. I'm not quite sure. I know that I mentioned the several that Baum wrote himself until he died in 1919. I think the last two were actually published after his death. One right after his death, the other one about a year later. So the last book written by Baum himself, I believe, came out in 1920. So, but now we're going to look at the first Wizard of Oz, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, compared to the 1939 film, the musical with Judy Garland that was Technicolor, and a lot of people have heard of. That's normally what people think of when they hear The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which is, so they think of the big Technicolor ruby slippers, Judy Garland singing, men in a lion suit, and yeah, it was a lion suit. And a lot of the possible horrors that went on during that filming. So I will talk about those at some point later at this video. But first, let's kind of have a look at how this musical compares to L. Frank Baum's actual book. Now, the central part of the story is the same. A little girl named Dorothy Gale, she and her little dog Toto are transported by a twister to the land of Oz. Her house lands on a witch. She basically rescues these Munchkin people that had been enslaved by this witch. She interacts with another good witch, this case. There's a differentiation there. But she interacts with a good witch who gives her this other witch's shoes and tells her, it's like, in order to get home, you have to follow this yellow brick road. And so they leave. She follows the road. She runs into a scarecrow, a tin man, and then later a lion. And the three of them all have goals to get aid. The scarecrow wants brains, the tin man wants a heart, and the lion wants courage. So they go on an adventure to get to the Wizard of Oz. The poppy scene is in both the film and the book, though there's a different connection there. If you hadn't noticed, the second witch doesn't show up yet, so we will get there. So they go to the general story. They go to the Oz. Oz tells them, you have to kill this witch. Otherwise, I'm not going to do anything for you. So they go and end up killing the witch by dumping water on her. That's the same in both books. They go back to Oz. He turns out to be a fraud. To an extent. In the book, Dorothy calls him a humbug. He's a circus man who landed in Oz. I don't think in the film they don't give his backstory at all. Not that I can remember. It's been a very long time since I've seen the film. But essentially, you kind of get this similar thing. He fakes his way through giving the scarecrow brains and the tin man a heart, though once again they go about it a little differently, the same with the lion. And then of course Toto the dog interferes with Dorothy getting in the hot air balloon and getting out of Oz. And that's kind of, and then the movie ends there. The good witch shows up, tells her, oh, you just need to click your shoes and go home. The book, if you saw my review, that's where one of the big differences happens. The book goes on for a little bit longer because they have to. And this is one of the major differences, and people make funny about this. There are two good witches, one is the north, one is the south. The one that Dorothy interacts with first is the good witch of the north. All she does is, she's a little old lady, about 5 feet tall, if I remember the book correctly, kisses her forehead, gives her the shoes. That's it. She doesn't tell her anything else. It's possible that she doesn't know what the shoes do. She just knew they were magical. And so she took them off and literally gave them to Dorothy and kissed her on the forehead, which gave her protection. So it's actually, Glenda is the good witch of the south. They actually have to travel to her. And she's the one who tells Dorothy, oh, you just kind of have to click your heels and go home. So that's a major difference. The Wicked Witch of the West isn't the major villain in the story. They don't run into her until they're sent by the wizard to essentially go kill her. And she doesn't know they're being sent to kill her anyway. She happens to see them walking and want the lion. Not Dorothy, not anybody else. She just wants the lion as a slave to pull her chariot. So she sends a bunch of monsters to try to kill them and eventually uses the flying monkeys. Now there's another big twist. Major big difference. The flying monkeys are not her minions in the book. They have a whole other backstory that involves a cursed hat. And so she just uses her last wish on this hat to summon them to get the lion to her, and they happen to have to bring Dorothy because she's been protected by the Good Witch of the North. And then she enslaves Dorothy because she realizes Dorothy doesn't know that she's protected, and she tries to starve the lion to death. And again, then she tries to get the shoes. That's how Dorothy ends up intentionally throwing water on her because she's tried to steal her shoes. And there's the other difference. The red shoes were for Technicolor. That's it. The shoes in the books were silver. There's a whole bunch of arguments, backstories about what that represented, but as far as I can tell from Baum, he denied it during his lifetime. It doesn't make sense for a fairy tale story. So that's people reading politics into a children's story. So that's the other big difference is, yeah, the witch didn't actually intend to get Dorothy. She wasn't the big villain in the book. There isn't really a villain in this book. It's more of a series of adventures and challenges they have to overcome. So, and again, the other big difference that the movie decides to do is it's all a dream sequence. Yep, nope. In the book, it's real. Dorothy goes back to Oz multiple times. I believe I've read in the synopsis what is supposed to be the last book that doesn't end up becoming the last book that Baum writes is her and her aunt and uncle end up living in Oz. So Oz does in fact exist. And there's a bunch of other fairy lands around there. So I didn't get fully into it. I got bored with it because the books themselves can be meandering. So yeah, there's quite a few differences. The book is a whole heck of a lot darker, partially because it was written in 1900, so over close to 40 years before the film came out. So it's obviously it's also not a musical. And here's the other big difference, and this comes up with some of the horrors that happened in the film. The Munchkins are under 5 feet tall. In the film, the filmmakers wanted them under 4 feet tall, so they kind of screwed up there. And Dorothy is a heck of a lot younger. She describes herself very much as a child. I'm guessing about maybe 9 or 10. I remember correctly. She does describe herself. She hasn't hit 5 feet yet. She's still relatively young. So she's very much a child. As opposed to Judy Garland, who was about 16 when she filmed this. And the other thing is, from what I can tell, the Scarecrow is also probably no taller than 5 feet. And so most likely with the Woodsman, because she found them both in Munchkinland. So that's the other major difference, is they were actually supposed to be a heck of a lot shorter, as was the Good Witch of the North. I don't remember them talking about the height of the Good Witch of the South. They do mention that she has a giant army of girls, though. But that goes back to Baum being a major feminist, particularly of the time, considering who his wife was. So there you have it. That's kind of the general differences. The film, from what I've been able to gather, was kind of it's a case of human rights violations up the wazoo. A lot of people know a lot about what happened to Judy Garland. She was put on drugs, uppers, downers, told to smoke cigarettes and eat nothing. Some of the other stuff I found out is even the other actors, the other 3 men actors, weren't really eating anything but a liquid diet because of the makeup that they were wearing. It was liquid latex. The Tin Man was the second Tin Man. The first one ended up in an iron lung. I believe the actor who did that was known for playing in the Beverly Hillbillies. He played the dad in the Beverly Hillbillies, and he ended up, I believe, in an iron lung, and the production didn't care. The Wicked Witch of the West ended up with 3rd-degree burns in that first scene, and from what I saw, I think I saw a few on YouTube, people were posting the interviews with the actress, I believe Margaret Hamilton, according to her, they did not care at all. She had to call a friend to take her to the hospital. She was in the hospital with 3rd-degree burns. She refused to do the broomstick riding in the air thing that was a stunt double, who also got third-degree burns, and I believe was permanently scarred. Again, the production didn't care. They just didn't care because they were horrible human beings from what I can tell, and that was Hollywood back then. They treated their actors and stunt doubles like objects. There are various weird horror stories when it comes to the Munchkins. They were apparently paid less than the dog. So, and I think from what I could know, it was like $125. You also have to understand, this film came out in 1939. So freak shows were still a thing. There were still circuses and stuff. So the little people were still considered subhuman. Mind you, so were people of color. Once again, this is 1939. Here's another interesting fact that I found. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was a bomb at the box office. It did not make money when it first came out. It made money. They did a re-release after the war, and then it made money, and then it made its major money when it went on television, and it started airing on television. That's when it became a hit. Wasn't an instant hit. It didn't, like I said, apparently did not make money when it first came out in 1939. The U.S. wasn't in the mood for it. I mean, we were on the verge of war. So a happy-go-lucky musical was not really what anybody was interested in. And why Judy Garland is mostly known for Over the Rainbow, you gotta think, if that movie was a bomb, that's not what she was known for until years later, after the war, when it was released maybe 5 or 6 years later, when people were longing for this kind of magical land to forget about the war times. So I haven't seen the film. I probably wouldn't show it to my kids, partially because of this horrible backstory of how horribly these people were treated. And a lot of people were terrified by the Wicked Witch of the West. I don't remember being really terrified by her. I'm more terrified now of the fact that, one, the woman looked like, I think Margaret Hamilton was a really nice person, and she got third-degree burns and had to call a friend to go to the hospital, and they wanted her back on set quickly. Like, yeah. Unfortunately, she was under contract by these people. She was pretty much, they owned their actors and actresses. And here's the other thing I forgot to mention. The lion suit was made out of lion hide. So they were under Technicolor lights, which are extremely hot, in a lion hide. It was extremely hot. I think it also was extremely heavy. So hundreds of pounds under blazing lights. Yeah, it doesn't sound like fun. So he was pretty miserable. And they weren't necessarily being paid a ton of money because, once again, it was a studio system. So the studios owned these people, essentially. Most of the actors, I believe, in this film were studio players. So they were owned by, I believe it's Universal, who owns the film rights to this specific film. Remember, the book is out of copyright. I think it was coming out of copyright at the time they made this film. So that's kind of one of the reasons they swapped it up. The other thing I'm going to talk about is a slightly less known film because it bombed like crazy. It's become a cult classic, is Return to Oz, which is very interesting. It takes bits and pieces from the film, bits and pieces from 2 books, Ozma of Oz and why I can't remember, which is actually the 3rd book, and I can't remember the name of it. The 2nd book off the top of my head. Well, we'll add it later, but it takes most of it from Ozma of Oz, which actually does not take place. They kind of mess things up. Ozma of Oz does not really take place much in Oz. It takes place in another land, which I believe I mentioned in my first review when I was actually looking at it on the internet. And I did actually read that book. Most of the plot comes from Ozma of Oz, where you have Dorothy coming back with Bill the chicken and hooking up with a bunch of people to rescue this family who's been captured by the Gnome King. Ozma, the movie kind of mixes a few things up. One, Ozma's already been changed back from her boy form. Yeah, the 2nd book involved a little boy named Tip, who turned out to be Ozma at the end of the book. So that's interesting. I'll link my, try to link my Oz review at the end of this video, or you can look at it on my channel, and it will kind of give you a little bit more in depth of what happens in that book. So very interesting story. A little bit of boy turning into girl there, slightly reluctantly. But most of the Return to Oz covers and goes over this third book where Dorothy, along with her friends, are rescuing this family who's their king of this land, sold them to the Gnome King and then committed suicide because he regretted it, selling his wife and children to the Gnome King for long life. That didn't turn out all that well. So it is an interesting film. A lot of people consider this far darker, but notably, the books were darker. And from what I can tell, I remember seeing this movie, they actually kept stuck to a lot of the characters pretty well. So the Wheelers everybody is terrified of, yep, those are in the books. And they're described quite clearly. Mind you, if you think about it logically, they're harmless. And TikTok, the little automaton in the film as well as in the book, it shows them. It's like they don't have arms or legs. They really can't do anything but possibly bite you. So, and they act all scary because that's all they got. So, why this terrified this, that was actually in the book. The Gnome King was in the book, though he didn't have any ruby slippers because ruby slippers not in the book. And in the book, I believe the silver shoes fall off over the desert, so they're gone. So he has a belt, and they end up stealing the belt. So it's a very interesting story. The Return to Oz minus the whole beginning thing where they think Dorothy's going crazy and possible fake Ozma there. Not in the book. Dorothy falls into the ocean en route to Australia. That's how she ends up in the ocean in the books. That's how she ends up back into this separate land, and that's never explained. But once again, these are fairy stories, and they're meant to be very imaginary, and they were very much loved by children. So they bought this because it's a fairy tale, and that's what it's supposed to be. So it's an interesting film. Again, it's mostly Ozma of Oz, which is a funny title for a book that barely. Ozma plays a big part in the book to an extent because she's coming to rescue this family. Dorothy's eventually brought along for the ride after being rescued by a woman who wants to steal her head. Yeah, they mess up the names in there, but they get the basic concept of this woman changing around heads. It's not really taught. She's not really considered evil in the books. She's just a nuisance who tries to take Dorothy's head and then is mostly forgotten until the very end. And the queen, when returned, she's like, "You can go back to being a nuisance and just go over there." So in the book, she's kind of one of the villains, but yeah, not really in the book at all. And again, the film does that whole thing that the original movie did where it was kind of all a dream, possibly. Yeah, again, in the book, Oz is real, the lands are real, all this stuff actually happens, and Dorothy does eventually get sent home. I believe Ozma helps. I think they use the magic belt to get her home this time. And she ends up back in not really home. She doesn't go back to Kansas. She goes to Australia because that's where she was heading because her uncle kind of had a nervous breakdown and needed a break. So they went from Kansas to Australia. Yeah, the following book that actually happens after Ozma involves an earthquake in San Francisco and going to the center of the earth. Again, watch my book review. Elf Regenbaum gets very, very weird. So that's kind of it. This is kind of a quick overview. The movie's a classic. If you want to see it, show it to your kids, go ahead. Depends on your kids. Some kids get scared of this thing. I personally wouldn't, just because there's a lot of horrors going on. I probably couldn't get out of my head just how horribly they treated the actress. I mean, the actors in this film. You hear the horror stories of what happened to this poor woman and how she ended up dying of drug overdose. Her voice is beautiful. She's 16 years old. She's constantly being told she's fat and being wearing a corset because she's playing a character that was supposed to be 10. So, yeah, there's that. They actually originally wanted Shirley Temple for this, but she was owned by Fox. And I still think she was a little bit older, but Fox wouldn't let her go. So, there's that. They were originally trying to get Shirley Temple in there, who probably would have played it better when she was a little bit younger, but I think she was about 16 as well, because they wanted the voice, because this was all about this being some big musical. Mom probably would have liked it, because he was a theater man. That's what he did. But again, I'm not going to show it to my kids just because of the whole horrible backstories with the actors, and the books are better. The books are far more interesting and far more in-depth and far quirky and slightly scarier. So in this case, if you want to watch the film, go ahead. Do I recommend it showing to really young kids? No, it'll probably scare the living daylights out of a lot of them. A little bit older, probably no younger than 10, would really see this film. And if they're sensitive and have nightmares, don't. You'll most likely terrify the living daylights out of them. The same with Return to Oz, that book. Electroshock therapy is involved in the beginning of the back, and that book, apparently that film was known to terrify a bunch of children. It's now a cult classic. To me, it's actually slightly closer to the books, even though it combines two, because once again, it's not a musical, and it kind of leans into the weird and quirky, which is more of what the books are. So that's it for this review. If you like what you see, like and subscribe. Thank you.
Hello, this is Tiffany from the editing room. So in the process of editing my Wizard of Oz film reviews, realized a few things. One, Universal was not the creator of the Wizard of Oz, it was MGM. So they owned all the actors. They were the ones who were just creating it. A few other things I realized when looking at the Wikipedia page, this movie had a lot of problems. Besides the whole human rights problems, there was several director issues. So interchanging directors, some of the directors were dicks, some were not. Basically, there was just a lot of production problems. And again, as I said earlier in the review, it was not a financial success. Not because it doesn't necessarily do great, it was really, really expensive to film this thing. So when it came out in 1939, the U.S. was in the middle of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression had just we were nearly the end, but again, it's 1939. People were still suffering from the Depression, and Europe had just started a war. Things were not fun at this time. So it was really re-released literally 10 years later, back in 1949. And that's when it kind of started to make it a little bit more money. Now, it was critically acclaimed when it came out. There was a whole bunch of positive reviews, awards, and everything. But again, it didn't make that much money to make up the production cost because it was very, very expensive to make. Lion suits, all those lights, torturing their actors, all those munchkins, torturing possibly the munchkins and underpaying them. But yeah, cost a lot of money. It was then made even more money when MGM sold the TV rights to CBS in, double check the Wikipedia page here, 1956. So that's when it went to television. And then, 56 as an installment in the Ford Star Jubilee. So that's when it first aired, and then they did another repeat in 59. And it got more TV audiences then. Mind you, there wasn't a lot of television. This is the 50s. So it was released on video cassette, VHS in 1980. MGM owned it then. It is now being released by Warner Home Video. So that would be Warner Brothers. So the Laserdisc was in 83. They did 50th anniversary. And the DVD release was in March 26, 1997. So MGM-Turner Films are the ones who owned that at the time. So technically it's now a classic. So they were 2 DVD releases in 2005 when they started doing a bunch of restorations and adding commentary to it, in a Blu-ray in 2009. So this is still, basically, it bombed the box office when it came out and has since become a massive classic. Otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it, or the torture of various actors. So that was it. Is there any more information here besides the fact that it's been re-released and all sorts of things over and over again? Apparently they did an IMAX 3D re-release in 300 theaters in 2013. They did they messed with it a lot. Again, it bombed the box office, and it was re-released a couple of times to make more money, and it was loved. I mean, it was loved at the time, but again, it was extremely expensive to make. Because again, all the costumes, lion hides, all the makeup, and all those lights. Because once again, color was not the norm back then. So having this film in Technicolor was a big, big deal. So that's a little bit of attention. Again, it was created by MGM. I do believe it might, yeah, so it's still, yeah. Warner Brothers still exists. But it's hard to tell these days, considering all the buyouts and sorts of things with films. And no, Disney does not own the rights. It's essentially, the books are out of copyright, so they can mess with things. I think I had another reviewer mention many years ago in a review that Disney does not like this because they can't copy the witch's costume, so specific color of green on the face and the specific witch's hat and the costume she's wearing that Disney desperately wants to copy because they've done a bunch of Wizard of Oz stuff, but they can't. The film, considering what came out in 1939, is still under copyright. The book is not, as are. I don't think all of the books are out of copyright. They might be. Everything that Baum wrote is out of copyright. But nonetheless, that's a little addition. Thank you.